Afternoon, Year 11s. Welcome to history. So, continuing from last lesson, we're going to look at what was Elizabethan society like in the age of exploration, in the age of discovery from 1558 to 88. So, the lesson question at the top is why did poverty, so we're going to be focusing mainly on poverty today, why did poverty increase in Elizabethan England, and what were the main responses to the poverty from the British public? Okay, so your tasks for today is to go through the explanation of the PowerPoint, and you are going to complete the lesson assignment that I've attached to the lesson on the Google Classroom. Okay, so some images right there for you of Britain at the time during the Elizabethan era, there's high levels of poverty and it was on the rise. It was getting worse and worse and worse. That meant loads and loads of people during that time were poor, had no food, no shelter, no water, and there are some really good images of a woman and a man who represent that. Okay, so poverty being a huge problem during that time, what caused it, what was the main reasons behind it, and we're going to look at the main responses from the British public and also from the government in response to the poverty under Elizabeth. Moving on with the next part of our lesson. Alright, so today's lesson was Elizabethan England under threat from a Rascali rebellage. That's what our lesson is going to be. That's what our lesson is going to be next week, sorry. Today's lesson is going to be why did poverty increase in England? So, key word for today's lesson is vagabond. It is a noun. The wandering poor was called a vagabond. Definition: a person who wanders from place to place without a job. That is what a vagabond is, an unemployed person who wanders from place to place. In Elizabeth's reign, it was felt that some of the poor, especially the vagabonds who wandered from place to place without a job, made no attempt to find work. They were poor. Idleness, not working, was seen by some as a sin and thought there would be punishment. During that time, there were thousands of vagabonds who lived in the countryside and wandered the countryside from place to place without a job, seeking and wanting money from the rich and begging money from people who looked like they had it, etc., etc. So write your own sentence using the word vagabond as part of your task as part of the task on the Google Classroom today, on that assignment. Moving on. So who were the poor in Elizabethan England? There had always been poor people in society, but the number of poor people increased really quickly during Elizabeth's reign. Some historians identified the poor as those who spent 80% of their income on bread. A survey of the poor in Norwich, East England, was undertaken in 1570. The survey showed that 40% of the poor counted were under 16 years of age. Families headed by women, often widows, also tended to be poor as women were paid a lot less than men if they had to work. Okay. So, some really key reasons why poverty increased during Elizabeth's era. So, one reason why it increased was because of population growth. Another reason is because of rising prices of goods and services. Number 3, changes in the countryside, so sheep farming. Number 4, changes in the countryside, enclosure. And then number 5, there were also other factors, other reasons why poverty in Britain under Queen Elizabeth increased. So, for example, right there, some really good other factors, okay, like wars, cloth trade collapse, inflation, bad harvest, some really good reasons why poverty increased. And we're going to look at that in more detail in our lesson today. So you know why poverty increased in Elizabeth England. Moving on. So, population growth. So during Elizabeth's reign, England's population grew as much as 35%. This was spread throughout the country, but towns and cities grew particularly fast in regards to their population. London became the fastest growing city in population in England, at a population of 150,000 people in 1603, 10 times the size of England's second there were more people to feed in London, the price of food in towns and cities like London rose. More people equals more demand for food, which equals to higher prices, which unfortunately many people in Britain could not afford, which ultimately led to their poverty. Rising prices and inflation. So linking back to that last slides, prices of goods rose even higher when harvests were bad and there wasn't enough food to go around. Food production grew much more slowly than the population itself. Okay, you can almost link this to the hyperinflation that took place in Germany in 1923, where the prices of goods got so high because the economy was so bad that it led to people not being able to afford food, which led to their poverty. So you can almost link it to that. Poverty also increased because wages did not rise as fast as prices. With more people wanting to work, labour was a lot cheaper. Many landowners and employers who owned the land, who owned businesses, who owned shops, cut wages to keep their costs down. Greater supply of workers meant that there was a decrease in wages for employees that worked in the farms or worked on the land or worked in businesses. Prices of goods were going up and food was going up. People's wages, unfortunately, were not going up. It was getting less, and this ultimately led to poverty. Increased demand for food, most likely due to rising population, rising families, meant prices rose as there was an inability to produce food to meet this demand. As population grew, the demand for land also increased. This meant that landowners could charge higher rents for land where people lived and also farmed. When someone took over a piece of land, they also had to pay an entry fee. These went up too, which also led to poverty. Some tenants who lived on the land could not afford to keep their land. Others, unfortunately, were evicted to make way for sheep farming. When you are evicted, it means you are kicked out. Okay, so a lot of people, unfortunately, were kicked out. Who lived on the land were kicked out from the land, so that landowners and farm owners could have the space on the land to sheep farm, and this led to high levels of poverty for people who were evicted from the land, who lived on the land. Changes in the countryside, so sheep farming. English wool and cotton wool accounted for 81.6% of England's exports during Elizabeth's time as Queen. The price of wool increased as demand for woolen cloth grew. This meant that farming sheep became very profitable and more landowners turned to it as a way to make money. The increase in sheep farming was blamed for problems because sheep farming took land that once been used for growing crops or as common land that everyone could use to farm and also live in. Farming sheep did not require as much labor as growing crops, so rural unemployment rose. Feeding sheep over the winter meant that some crops were grown only for animals to eat. This angered people as large numbers were going hungry or could not afford bread. So as you can see, the changes in the countryside led to high levels of poverty for a huge number of reasons, mainly linking to sheep farming. Furthermore, so another really important reason why poverty increased in England was because of changes in the countryside enclosure. So we're going to go into more detail as to what enclosure is. So enclosing land meant replacing large open fields that were farmed by villagers with individual fields belonging to one person. So really important that we remember that, what enclosing is. And that contributed towards high levels of poverty in England at the time. Enclosure often led to small farms being merged together, and tenant farmers being evicted. It also resulted in unemployment and rural depopulation, which again links and created poverty and increased poverty in the process. If you are unemployed, you got to really think about it. If there's high levels of unemployment, it means people cannot afford to live in their current homes, whether that's on the land, or whether that's in their actual homes itself. And this led to obviously people not being able to afford the rent, and led to them being evicted, which led to poverty. Farmers chose to enclose their land because, thanks to new techniques and ideas, spreading printing press, some farmers began to control animal breeding to produce better livestock. Therefore, they needed to keep them in closed fields to stop them wandering off. Keeping animals in enclosed fields also stopped them trampling on other crops. We're going to move on to the next slides. So, moving on. So, do read in more detail the changes in the countryside enclosure, so you get a really good understanding as to how that contributed towards poverty in England. Other factors, some really good other factors as to why poverty increased, which I want all of you to read and get into really good detail with so you understand those key factors. Reasons for increase in vagabondage, okay? Really important that we understand why there was high levels of people in Britain who wandered around with no job, who were homeless, and travelled around begging for money, sometimes stealing and also committing crimes. So some really good information right there to support you. So for example, read rural depopulation was a really good reason why vagabondage increased. And vagabondage is a very pivotal reason as to why poverty was on the rise, because there was a rise and increase in vagabondage. Attitudes towards the poor, so changing attitudes, responses. Poverty was almost considered to be your own fault in Elizabethan times, but attitudes started to change towards the end of Elizabeth's reign as queen, and the government decided to take action. This was because fears that the social order might be threatened if the growing number of poor people ganged together, and vagabonds and beggars might turn to crime, which would then cause fear, which would then cause chaos, which would then make the government feel like they can't control and manage their population because of the high levels of crime. Fears that the poor might spread disease, and landowners giving more to the poor. The poor in Elizabethan England were divided in two categories: impotent and deserving poor, and the able-bodied idle poor. So do read into more detail those two categories and who they were and their differences. Oops, my mistake. Impotent poor. So have a read over that. Government action. Really important that we understand what the main responses were to poverty during Elizabeth's era. So what did the government do in response to the poverty? Government action. So new laws were passed by Elizabeth's parliament. The main reason for this was the fear of vagrancy and social unrest. So two acts that were introduced was 1563, the Statute of Artificers. That's one law that was passed, and the next one was 1572, the Vagabonds Act. So do read in more detail what those acts were, and this is showing you what Elizabeth and her government did in response to the poverty that was increasing in Britain at the time. Okay. Also, other laws and acts that were passed was the Poor Relief Act in 1576, and then in 1601 you had the Act for the Relief of the Poor. So what was the impact of Elizabeth's poor laws? So although there were some changes for the better, poverty still continued to be a massive problem during Elizabeth's reign. This was largely due to the conflict with Spain and the revolt in the Netherlands, which hit trade really badly. So if you read from this slide, so not much impact and good impact of the laws, it will tell you the impact it made, these laws, and how the government responded. Okay, so if I'm going to go back. So all classes had equal opportunities to enjoy leisure activities. That is false. There's always been poor people in society, but the number of poor people increased quickly during Elizabeth's era. What percentage of poor in Norwich were under 16 years old? The answer is 40%. How much did the population grow during Elizabeth's reign? That answer is 35%. What percentage of exports were woolen cloth in Elizabeth's reign? The answer is 81%. 81.6%, that's number A, that's A. What type of farming meant that only growing food to survive, not to sell? That was arable farming. What were poor people who couldn't work known as? They were known as the impotent poor. What were poor people who could work but chose not to? That was the idle poor. Which act of government ensured that poor relief was collected? That is the 1563 Statute of Artificers. Which act of government stated that raw materials would be provided to the able-bodied poor so that they could make things to sell? That was the Poor Relief Act. Which act of government stated that vagrants were to be whipped and have a hole drilled through each ear? That was the Vagabond Act of 1572, and that is the lesson over. Okay, please do go through the lesson slides in more detail. Do read it carefully. Do understand the impact that poverty had on Britain. Do you understand that it did really increase during Elizabeth's reign for many reasons that we've looked at already? And also just really reflect and think about how did the government respond? What laws did they pass in response to the high levels of poverty, and what impact did it make? Did it make a positive one or negative one or both? Do really reflect and look at that. Okay, have a really good day, Year 11s. Make sure that work is completed for next Wednesday. That's when it should be completed and submitted to me. And I look forward to reading your work and giving you feedback when I get given the opportunity and time from you. Perfect. Have a lovely day, guys. See you soon. Have a great weekend ahead.